Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Civil War Roundtable Congress for hosting me today. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about my favorite subject, which of course is George Boutwell, a family member of mine who has long been hiding in plain sight in terms of his importance to American history. I'll explain briefly that George and I have a common ancestor going back to the New England Boutwells of the 1600s. The first one was James Boutwell, an indentured servant who arrived from England in 1632. And essentially, George and I kind of are descended from New England farming families of New Hampshire and Massachusetts that came down through the generations. George was born in 1818. I had a cousin of his who was born in 1820, Rodney Cleves Boutwell, who is my direct ancestor. But that's the genealogy of how I'm related to George. He's a distant family member and a kind of a long lost cousin. I didn't know much about George growing up. I grew up in the Boston area. George had been the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in a significant Civil War and Reconstruction era figure, but I never really knew much about him. My family never talked about him. It was only when I was in my 20s and 30s that, in reading history, which I have always loved, I would come across his name as having been an ally of Lincoln during the Civil War and then Secretary of the Treasury for U.S. Grant and Reconstruction. So little by little, I got to know about George into my 30s and 40s and 50s. The revelation of wanting to do a book really came in about 2010 when I read Nicholas Lemon's Redemption, The Last Battle of the Civil War, all about the redemption of white supremacist governments in the South by white Democrats during Reconstruction. And I'll get to that later in terms of a very important role that George Boutwell played vis-a-vis Mississippi in the 1870s. But that really kind of motivated me to learn more about George. I started reading up on him. And just as COVID was starting in March of 2020, I thought, well, I'm going to do a long essay for my family just so that they know who this guy was. But the more I looked into it, the more I did research online. And then when it was possible to go to the Library of Congress and the Lincoln and Grant presidential libraries, I knew that there was a full-length biography just waiting to be written. So that's what this is all about. I like to think of George as the most consequential political figure that Americans have never heard of. And there are two reasons that I do that. One, and the less important one, is the length of his career. George was in public service from 1839 to 1905. The very first president he met was Martin Van Buren in Washington in 1839. The last one he came face to face with was Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. Along the way, he was a very close friend and political ally of both Lincoln and Grant during Civil War and Reconstruction. He was one of the leading foes of Andrew Johnson during the impeachment proceedings of the 1860s. And as I mentioned, he had an intimate relationship with Teddy Roosevelt in the sense that George was president of the Anti-Imperialist League after the Spanish-American War that opposed Roosevelt's plan to annex the Philippines following that war. So a length of career that really spanned 65, 66 years consistently. Much more importantly, though, for George is his wide range of experience and expertise. I do like to say that many American public figures have been expert in one of several different public policy areas. George was expert in these three: domestic policy and civil rights, economic policy and finance, and then foreign affairs. Equally conversant in all three of those areas, and we will explain why. So that's my little pitch as to why George is so important. Later, I'll get to the important question of, well, if he's so important, how come most Americans and even those well-versed in history have never heard of him? And I've got, I think, some solid answers for that. But first, let's get some background on George. Mr. Boutwell goes to Washington with apologies to Jimmy Stewart on the famous movie of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. George was born in 1818 in Brookline, Massachusetts. At the time, it was farming country right close to Boston. His father was a manager of a farm for a wealthy landowner. and George grew up in a farming family. He learned to graft fruit trees by the age of 10. He worked the fields and tended to the cattle as a young man, going to school when possible, but never after the age of 10. He really was homeschooled and self-educated, much like Lincoln. So born in Brookline, his father then buys a farm in central Massachusetts where George, learns the agricultural trade. A very important date is 1835. George is 17 years old. He moves to Groton, Massachusetts to take a job in a dry goods store as an apprentice, and he has plans for reading law at the same time. Well, at that time in history, Groton, Mass. Was a quite important intellectual and political center in Massachusetts, just a little bit west of Concord, Mass., for those who have been to Concord. But Groton had a number of sharp-eyed lawyers who George would study with. It was also the home to Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist um, group. Margaret Fuller was a close ally and friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And George knew her in Groton, and through her got to know people like Emerson and Thoreau and everything that the Transcendentalists stood for. Well, 4 years later, George is a budding lawyer. He goes to Washington to work on some legal cases at the age of 20, and he has a seminal experience in visiting the slave pens of Washington and seeing the Black families who have been split up, ripped apart, with some of them being shipped down the river to Louisiana and Mississippi. And he talks to several of the family members around these slave pens and gets a visceral firsthand impression of the horrors of slavery. Comes back to Massachusetts. He's a Democrat at that point. As a farming boy, he makes sense for him to be in the Democratic Party. He serves 7 terms in the Massachusetts House, becomes the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in 1851. But increasingly in the 1850s, as we all know, the country was splitting over slavery, as were the 2 major political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. George could not stomach the Southern Democratic hold on the party and its support of slavery, and gradually drifts apart from the Democratic Party, so that in 1855, he joins with others in Massachusetts to found the fledgling Republican Party. He becomes increasingly important in the state Republican Party, so much so that in 1860, he's a delegate to Lincoln's Republican convention in Chicago. At this point, George's writing skills are so well known and so well respected, he's asked to be one of 7 delegates at that convention to draft the Republican Party on which Lincoln will run and win the 1860 national election. And of course, one of those planks is the all-important plank of Republicans opposing no extension of slavery into the Western territories, which then leads the Southern states to secede and leads to the outbreak of the Civil War in April of 1861. Well, George then plays an important role as a kind of a liaison between Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts and the Lincoln administration in supplying Union Massachusetts troops and supplies to the Union in the early days of the war. He comes to know Lincoln quite well during this, has meetings with Lincoln at the White House, so that in 1862, Lincoln appoints George as the country's first ever revenue commissioner. Congress has just passed a comprehensive tax act to introduce new taxes, including an income tax, to help pay for the Union war effort against the Confederacy. And George essentially has to start from scratch. He arrives on July 17th, 1862. Imagine this, to a basement office in the Treasury building, the sprawling Treasury building next to the White House. He's got 3 staff assistants, and he's asked to implement an incredibly complex array of taxes all over the country by which to fund the Union war effort. Through a quite Herculean effort, George is working 7 days a week, often well into the night, past midnight. In the next 8 months, he is so successful in building up the Revenue Bureau that when he leaves in March 1863 to take a seat in Congress, Revenue Bureau has over 3,000 assessors and tax collectors all throughout the northern states that are critical in funding the Union war effort. Well, that's what George is doing up until 1862. He's come to know Lincoln very well, but he's not really that well known in at the top leadership levels of the Republican Party, and he certainly is not well known to the American public. He's an important Republican functionary, you might call him at that point, but not well known. That is all going to change on August 6th, 1862. And to me, this is one of the really important events in George Boutwell's political life. He's asked to give a speech at the Great War meeting of August 6th, 1862, that's held on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. It was held to raise Union morale during the dark summer of 1862. Remember that McClellan is retreating from the Virginia Peninsula. Union wounded are all over Washington. Funds are running low, which is why they've passed the Revenue Act and brought George in to raise money. And even Edwin Stanton, the war secretary, and George McClellan are sniping at each other and have a running feud over the conduct of the war. So the Lincoln administration and the DC government call for this Great War meeting on the steps of the Capitol to help raise morale and to reinvigorate the fight for the Union that the Civil War represents. There are 10,000 people there. As I've mentioned, Union morale is low. Lincoln is on the platform that day under under the banner or the bunting that you can see, the platform there. Lincoln is sitting up there with Salmon Chase and Edward Bates, not scheduled to speak, but he's there to represent the administration. Well, George Boutwell has been asked to speak, and he's been penciled in as the second speaker that afternoon of 10 different speakers. Now, what's remarkable about this is that George Boutwell was a fierce abolitionist. He had been calling for abolition of slavery since the 1850s, even before the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, he fingered slavery as the cause of the Civil War, and he kept telling everybody he could talk to that the Union victory, would only come when the 4 million black slaves, enslaved blacks, had been freed in the South. And that's the message he's going to deliver at this Great War meeting. And as you can see, I mentioned the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association citation up there, spring 2025. I have an article about this in the Lincoln Journal, the current issue of the Lincoln Journal. So George is the second speaker, and he's going to denounce slavery, and everybody knows who's invited him that he's going to denounce slavery, but the audience doesn't, the public doesn't, because the rally has been called to, increase morale and to save the Union. Remember, at the time, Lincoln could only talk about saving the Union. He could not yet identify slavery as an end goal of ending slavery as a goal of the war. So George gets up, fiery speech that denounces slavery, which is then reported on in papers all across the country, black papers, white papers, and even papers in England, which of course was important at the time because the Confederacy was hoping that England would come in on the side of the South in the Civil War. But the British public was fiercely anti-slavery, and here was George Boutwell helping to, support their case for not having the British government, English government, come in and support the Confederacy. So newspaper reports are quite amazed that George Boutwell has been so precise and so explicit about, crushing the rebellion until we crush slavery. There's been this positive reaction in the newspapers all across the country, and it gives Boutwell an incredibly heightened political profile from that which he had before. Well, the timing of this, of course, is important because August 6th, 1862, Lincoln is talking about the Emancipation Proclamation with his cabinet. He first raises it on July 22nd with his cabinet, but it's not yet public notice that he's going to issue it anytime soon. But within several weeks after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd. And it's my contention, as I talk about it both in the book and in the article in the Abraham Lincoln Journal Association journal, that George Boutwell had helped prepare public opinion for Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So at the end of the day, on August 6, 1862, George Boutwell has a much higher political profile, especially within the Lincoln administration, but also among the public, than had been the case just 24 hours earlier. He goes back to the Treasury Department, continues his work on the Revenue Bureau, does that until March of 1863. And then we come to what I call the critical 14 years of George Boutwell's career in Washington. I'll go over this somewhat lightly. It's in the book. There's a lot of material here of how important George was as one of the leaders of the radical Republican Party in Congress, with people like Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, uh, in the following ways. George serves in the Congress for 6 years, in the House for 6 years, 1863 to 69, one of the leaders of the impeachment process against Andrew Johnson, and as a member both of the Joint Committee on Reconstruction and the House Judiciary Committee. George helps write and enact both the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Well, in 1869, Ulysses Grant now has just been elected president. George is expecting to stay in Congress, but Grant runs into trouble with his first nomination for Treasury Secretary. George is a um, strong political ally in Congress, but he needs him in his cabinet to provide political balance, and because of the expertise that George brings to the Treasury position. Remember, George had been governor of Massachusetts for 2 years, running a state budget, had then been revenue commissioner for Lincoln, so that by 1869, he is fully qualified to become U.S. Grant's Treasury Secretary, and he serves for 4 years. In addition to doing his Treasury work and helping put the American economy back on a firm foundation after the Civil War, George is also in charge of the U.S. Secret Service, which comes under the purview of the Treasury Department. And at the time, the Secret Service was very important for infiltrating and combating the KKK and other white supremacist groups in the South during the years of Andrew Johnson's presidency and then afterward. And so George continues to work with Grant in seeking to protect the gains of Reconstruction, protect the gains of the 14th and 15th Amendments for political rights for Blacks and others in the country in overseeing the Secret Service. Well, in 1873, George is elected to the U.S. Senate from Massachusetts, and he's able to go back to Congress, and where he serves for 4 years, 1873 to 1877. Again, is very important, critically important in a number of the last dying gasps of Reconstruction. 1875 Civil Rights Act. By this point, Thaddeus Stevens has died, Charles Sumner has died. George Boutwell is one of the few radical Republican leaders still in Congress, still working with Ulysses Grant to try and enhance and extend protections, political protections for the newly freed enslaved Blacks. So he helps pass the 1875 Civil Rights Act. And then in a very important and kind of a symbolically important role, this 1876 Mississippi Report. In 1876, George is the chair of a 5-member Senate Select Committee that is asked to go to Mississippi and investigate the voter fraud, intimidation, and violence that had occurred during the Mississippi state elections in 1875. Those elections returned Democrats to power. They chased the Republican governor, Adelbert Ames, out of the state. And it was kind of the next way station on the Southern white supremacist political parties reclaiming political power in the South at the end of Reconstruction. Now, George's report, they interviewed dozens of witnesses about what had gone on in Mississippi in 1875, and they produced a 2,000-page report that is still available today, easily available on the web. If you just Google Boutwell Mississippi Report, it'll come up. You can read the chilling testimony from individuals in Mississippi who had been wounded, harassed, and even killed, or family members killed during the election season in 1875. And it just served as an important documentary resource for how the South overthrew Reconstruction in 1875, 76, 77, at the end of the Grant administration, so that by the time Rutherford B. Hayes comes into power to the presidency in 1877, Reconstruction is pretty much all but dead. So if nothing else, George Boutwell's Mississippi Report from 1876 still stands as a testament to how he and Grant and others tried to save Reconstruction, but frankly, Northern white opinion was turning against it. The North was tired of having to protect Black rights. They wanted to get back to, the business of America being business and, reconstituting the economy. They were no longer interested in protecting Black rights in the South, which is why Reconstruction ended in 1876, 1877. I want to spend just a few minutes on what was really a revelation in researching and writing the book. As I mentioned, Boutwell had a very close relationship with Abraham Lincoln, given that he worked in the Treasury Department for the Revenue Bureau in 1862-63. He could just walk over anytime, which he often did, to meet with Lincoln, talk about the war, talk about how it was going, in addition to the revenue measures. And Lincoln came to rely on Boutwell quite a bit when George then went into the House of Representatives up until 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated. With U.S. Grant, however, George had a 21-year relationship, which really deepened into friendship, both between George and Grant and between the Grant and the Boutwell families. That relationship started in March of 1864. Most people will recognize that date as the month that Grant comes to Washington from the Western War Department to get his commission as Lieutenant General from Abraham Lincoln. There's a very important White House reception in March where Grant kind of arrives with dust all over his uniform and kind of in his usual self-effacing way, not proclaiming who he was, even to the Hotel Willard clerk who signed him into the hotel. But Grant arrives and Lincoln, receives him at the White House. George Boutwell is there with his daughter, Georgiana, who was a constant companion, social companion in Washington, and they meet Grant for the first time in March of 1864. Well, over the succeeding years, Boutwell gets to know Grant quite well after the end of the war, when Grant becomes General of the Army and finds himself in the middle of the controversy between Edwin Stanton as War Secretary and Andrew Johnson as President. Johnson essentially is trying to use Grant to maneuver Grant in his battle with Edwin Stanton, which upsets Grant extremely. And George, as a radical Republican leader in Congress, consorts or confers with Grant quite often as to how best to oppose Andrew Johnson's attempt to restore white supremacist government in the South. And so George gets to know Grant quite a bit through the writing of the Army Appropriation Act of 1867, through testimony that Grant gave in Congress in 1867 as well. George helps nominate Grant for the presidency in 1868. And of course, as I mentioned, Grant then nominates George and appoints him his Treasury Secretary. There's a wonderful story about Grant visiting the Boutwell home in Groton, Massachusetts in June of 1869. Grant had come up to Boston on an official visit, but wanted to come out with George to the family home in Groton and spent the night there visiting George and his family. And then in September of 1869, kind of the first major issue that Grant and Boutwell had to confront with the American economy was the famous gold ring scandal of Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, who tried to corner the gold market on Wall Street and ultimately were foiled by both Grant and Boutwell releasing gold into the market and deflating the price, which Fisk and Gould had tried to artificially inflate so that they could reap millions of dollars in profits. So these first 5 years, George is getting to know Grant, the two of them getting to know each other quite well, both on political Reconstruction type issues, but also on financial issues. As I mentioned, the relationship between George and Grant then deepened to their respective families. George's wife, Sarah, was an invalid for much of her life, so she stayed home in Groton, Mass, while George was in Washington in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. But on the right-hand side, Georgiana, his daughter, she came to Washington, lived with her father at the boarding house that they lived in, would go with him to a lot of functions and dinners. They would assist Julia Dent Grant at White House functions, and the two families really became to know each other much better once Grant became president. The Never Retrace My Steps quote from Grant, of course, is a famous one. He never liked to retreat. That came from his wooing of Julia Dent Grant in Missouri in 1844 when his horse came to a raging stream. And instead of going back, he pushed his horse through the stream so that he could see Julia. But there's a nice story of Georgiana Boutwell being at the White House with Grant for a dinner and her escorting him escorting her home after the dinner and using the quote of never retrace my steps. The note I've reproduced there was a very sentimental note that Grant sent to Georgiana on New Year's Day, 1885, when he was dying of cancer, expressing his admiration and his deeply felt sentiments for the Boutwell family. 4 months later, in April 1885, Georgie finds herself in New York City, does not want to leave without seeing Grant. She goes to their brownstone on East 66th Street. A dying Grant comes down from the second floor, knowing that she's in the house and not wanting her to get away without not saying hello. And they have a nice 2 hour meeting together before she goes on her way. The relationship between the families, as that last point, would extend, even after Grant's death in 1885. But I want to focus on that particularly because George Boutwell was close enough to Ulysses Grant that the Grant family wanted George to be one of the pallbearers at Grant's funeral in August of 1885. On this photograph of that, the procession that went through New York City, it snaked for 7 miles from southern Manhattan up to Riverside Park, where Grant would ultimately be buried in the tomb when it was built in 1897. The second carriage there on the lower end of the procession is George Boutwell and General John Logan of Illinois riding together closely behind the hearse that is carrying Grant's catafalque. And that's how deeply respectful the family felt of George, that they wanted him to be part of that funeral procession that was witnessed by 1.5 million people on the streets of New York in August of 1885. Well, as I mentioned, as everybody knows, the tomb wasn't built then. It wasn't ready yet for Grant. It wasn't ready until 1897. And a somewhat humorous story, 12 years later, George, of course, being a strong friend of the family, is invited to the dedication of the tomb, but his invitation went astray. It was sent to Washington, not home to his home in Groton, Massachusetts. It goes astray, and he's not able to make it to the dedication when it takes place in 1897. So that's a bit of the political history of George Boutwell in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, his deep relationships with both Lincoln and Grant, his vast importance in helping to frame the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and a number of other things. So the next question, of course, is why isn't George better known? Why has he been kind of ignored or even dismissed by historians for more than 100 years? To that, I answer that one answer, one part of it is his personality and how he was disdained by Boston elites. Now, George is a farm boy, doesn't have the education that many of the Boston Brahmins do. People like Henry Adams and others are terribly dismissive of a farm boy like George Boutwell. And George also wasn't a larger than life figure. He was not a self promoter like, say, Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner or Ben Butler, especially. He didn't kind of command the headlines as he did his work in the 1860s and 70s. He just got down to doing the work and doing it. So he isn't kind of promoting himself. And again, he's really disdained and looked down upon by many of the Boston Brahmin Whig elites, Henry Adams, Henry Cabot Lodge, later in life in the 1890s, people like that, the liberal Republicans who were very much anti-Grant in the 1860s and 70s. But much more importantly, George found himself, I believe, on the losing side of history in the major issues that he was involved in the 1860s, 70s, and afterward. For many years, as we know, the Johnson impeachment was not looked upon favorably at all. It was looked on as if these radical Republicans, Stevens and Boutwell and others, were just going after a president with no good reason and trying to toss him out of office. Secondly, there was the anti-Grant bias for many, many years, 100 years, among even professional historians like Alan Nevins and Samuel Eliot Morison. Grant was seen as corrupt and inefficient and political naive and not looked well upon in terms of his presidency for much of the time up until the late 20th century. This cartoon, common at the time, shows George Boutwell as a hurdy-gurdy grinder, and Ulysses Grant is his puppet, grabbing dollar bills off the shelves of the U.S. Treasury Department as if Grant had no idea what he was doing and was just manipulated by people like Boutwell and his Civil War cronies who he appointed to office. So George suffers from the anti-Grant bias. The anti-imperialist campaign, which I've not talked about too much, but that happened after the end of the Spanish-American War. McKinley and then Roosevelt said they want to annex the Philippines. Of course, they would control Cuba, Puerto Rico as well. And a number of Americans come together in the Anti-Imperialist League to protest that. They say America should not be in the business of sending its troops overseas to forcibly occupy territories that have fallen into its lap from the Spanish-American War. And those people included Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, Samuel Gompers, labor leader, Jane Addams of Hull House in Chicago, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington of the Black community. A wide-ranging political coalition of Americans come together in what really was the first anti-war movement in our country when America is beginning to flex its muscles overseas. Well, at the age of 80 years old, if you can imagine, George Boutwell is still vigorous. He's still writing opinion pieces and doing his law work, serving on international commissions. The other people involved in the league come to him at 80 years old and ask him to be president. Because of his reputation for upholding constitutional principles over a lifetime of political work, they ask him to be president, knowing that he will provide the leadership and the vigor to make the case for the anti-imperialists. George agrees. He does that for the next 7 years until 1905, when he dies of natural causes in his bed at his home in Groton, Massachusetts. But along the way, he's combating McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was one of the architects of the Filipino annexation from the Senate. And George is fighting that kind of last battle in his political career. Well, that anti-imperialist campaign had also been kind of looked down upon by American historians for many, many decades after it happened. Imagine that, Teddy Roosevelt personifies the red-blooded American who's taking America onto the world stage at the dawn of the 20th century. He sends the Great White Fleet around the world, flexing American power. And the folks like George, who constituted the Anti-Imperialist League, are seen as these 19th century old fogies, has-beens, trying to deny America its place on the world stage. And they came in for a lot of negative publicity from the Hearst newspapers, other Pulitzer newspapers, and from historians for trying again to deny America its rightful place on the stage. Well, historical revisionism and historical narratives, they do change over time. And following the Vietnam War in the 1950s and 60s, America's overseas adventures are looked at in a very different light. And the whole process of nation building and sending American troops to Southeast Asia took on a very different hue in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s than it had at the time of the anti-imperialist campaign. So that new histories of that campaign show it in a much more positive light. Well, there are three sides of history that George has kind of been seen negatively in, but easily the most important one is what's called Reconstruction and the Triumph of Lost Cause historiography. We all know how American historians, aided by the sons of the Confederate veterans and the daughters of the Confederacy, and a campaign to redeem and rehabilitate the Southern lost cause of maintaining its independence during the Civil War, really triumphed in the American political and social narrative at the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. American historians gave much credence and much positive reviews of Southern lost cause historiography. And in social affairs, just think of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation movie in 1915, which shows blacks as subhumans. It shows Thaddeus Stevens as this raving maniac. And it essentially tries to make the case that Andrew Johnson was a very positive president. All he was trying to do was bring the North and South back together, but on the South's terms, of reestablishing white political control in the South to the detriment of the newly freed 4 million enslaved blacks. Well, that is the narrative for much of the 20th century. And as a radical Republican, similar to Stevens and Charles Sumner, George is seen as one of these radical fanatics. All they wanted to do was crush the South under the heel of their boot. And no credence is given to their trying to establish political rights, political equality for the new citizens in the South who had been freed by the Civil War. So for much of the 20th century, George is seen negatively by lost cause historians. Well, one of the ways I like to end how those historical narratives have changed is by talking about Benjamin Arthur Quarles. Quarles is one of America's most prominent Black historians. In 1933, he's a young history student at the University of Wisconsin. He wants to write his master's thesis on a significant Black figure, say like Frederick Douglass. He's told by his white thesis advisor that he cannot do that. Sorry, Benjamin, you can't do that. One, there isn't enough primary source material about Blacks, and two, in a very condescending tone, we don't think Blacks writing about other Blacks can be objective. Quarles essentially is denied the opportunity to write about Black history in the 1930s. So he looks around and says, well, I want to write about this concept of Black agency, that Blacks have really made positive contributions to American history, positive contributions to their own emancipation before and during the Civil War, to their own entitlement and fulfillment as full American citizens. I want to write about Black agency. I've been told I can't write about a Black figure. So he turns around and he finds a white political figure that he thinks fully embodies the concept of Black agency, and that person is George Boutwell. I was absolutely amazed when I stumbled across this master's thesis on the internet in the course of my research. It's a 120-page master's thesis available from the University of Wisconsin. I sent away my $60 and got a copy of it. It's entitled Boutwell, A Radical with Reasons. And a young historian, Benjamin Quarles, is making the case that there indeed were good reasons why Boutwell, along with Stevens and Sumner and others, had good reasons for being radically progressive in terms of trying to protect Black rights. Well, he writes that thesis in 1933. A few years later, thankfully, one of his other thesis advisors relents and allows Quarles to write his PhD thesis on Frederick Douglass, which he then publishes as kind of the first major biography of Douglass in 1948. Quarles goes on to teach at Morgan State University, historically Black university, college and Black university in Baltimore. I was able to visit the Quarles archives up there. And I came across this wonderful letter from the Yale historian David Blight, written to Benjamin Quarles in 1983. This is 50 years after Quarles has written his master's thesis. David Blight is a young graduate student who wants to do a thesis on Frederick Douglass. So who does he turn to? Well, the person who kind of paved the way in writing about Douglass, Benjamin Quarles, who's down at Morgan State University. Blight writes this wonderful letter, which is in the Quarles archive, saying, here's my Tracy, here's my treatment. Can you go over it and give me some, you know, comments and suggestions on how to make it better as I get underway with my PhD thesis, which then, of course, goes on to become a biography of Frederick Douglass in 1917, I think it was, that wins the Pulitzer Prize. So a wonderful continuum from Benjamin Quarles in 1933 to David Blight writing to him in 1983, and then 30 years later, Blight writing a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Frederick Douglass. And the little kicker in this that I love to wait until the end to tell you is that in 1983, when David Blight is a young graduate student writing to Benjamin Quarles, where is he writing from? University of Wisconsin. Same place that had denied Quarles the opportunity to write about a Black person in 1933. David Blight is a graduate student there in 1983. Well, that arc of looking at from Quarles to Blight and how, American history is treated, how people like Frederick Douglass are treated, is very much the arc of the American historical narrative over the past 50 years, and the fact that it's changed tremendously with, I'm happy to say, some incredibly positive ramifications for George Boutwell. And this is why Boutwell has emerged from the shadows in the last 20 to 30 years. Listed here are the new histories that have been written about the four major issues that I talked about that George was involved in. The Andrew Johnson impeachment, new histories by David Stewart and Brenda Wineapple that give much more credence to the radical Republican case that Andrew Johnson certainly deserved to be impeached, even if he was acquitted by one vote, that there was a very solid case to make that Andrew Johnson was committing high crimes and misdemeanors in usurping the will of Congress, blocking Congress from spending appropriated funds, and that Andrew Johnson essentially was trying to create and construct an imperial presidency that would give him free hand in bringing a white supremacist South back into the American government. On the Grant presidency, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, most professional historians would have said Grant ranked right at the bottom of American presidents, down there with Warren G. Harding. Today, it's much different with these new histories by Ron Chernow, Ronald White, Charles Calhoun, several others. These aren't the only ones that really give Grant much credit for many of the accomplishments of his administration, the Alabama claims negotiations with Great Britain, the 14th and 15th, the 15th Amendment especially, the foundations of the American economy, coming after the rampant inflation of the Civil War and putting the American economy back on an even keel. Yes, there was corruption during the Grant presidency. Yes, he was naive in promoting several of his Civil War colleagues to important positions and then not recognizing when they were putting their hands in the till and stealing from the government. There are things that certainly Grant can be criticized for, but there are many positives that people like Chernow and White and Calhoun have talked about, so that today Grant's presidency is much more widely respected. And of course, given a central role played by George Boutwell in that presidency, his role has been rehabilitated as well. I talked about the effects of Vietnam on how the Philippines annexation was viewed, these new histories by Stephen Kinzer, Stanley Carno, Max Boot, and others make that case very persuasively that that McKinley and Roosevelt erred in sending 5,000 troops to the Philippines, several thousands of whom died. 200,000 Filipinos died in a vicious, vicious war, anti-insurgency campaign in the Philippines, and that America overextended itself by trying to annex the Philippines. Finally, of course, the big one is Reconstruction, and how Reconstruction is so widely differently viewed today than it was 50 or 60 years ago. Eric Foner, his seminal work on Reconstruction, I mentioned both Nicholas Lehman and Benjamin Quarles, but there are 5, 10, 15, 20 other quality histories, as we know, of Reconstruction that are using primary materials from the South, such as George's 2,000-page report on the Mississippi campaign to reconstruct and redeem the state in 1875, much greater use of primary source materials that show how Southern white supremacists used intimidation, fraud, and violence to beat the blacks down, beat white Republicans down in the South, to establish Jim Crow by the 1880s and 1890s, which was in effect until the civil rights legislation and Supreme Court decisions of the 1950s and 1960s. So all four of those areas are areas in which George Boutwell is much more positively seen today than would have been the case even 30 or 40 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago, and why I believe he deserves much more attention paid to him today, which is happening. I have finished my book a little over less than a year ago. It's been getting some very nice reviews from eminent historians and others in the field. Uh, Most welcome of all are kind of readers who read the book and say, geez, I'd never heard of George Boutwell before. And now that I know about him, I'm seeing his name everywhere. I go into books by, Foner and others, and I see how George Boutwell is quoted, and his accomplishments during Reconstruction are being touted by historians even more today than was the case 10 or 20 years ago. So indeed, he was a man ahead of his times, as Harold Holzer wrote in the Wall Street Journal, and he is getting finally, I think, the attention that he deserves. Which then brings me to my final slide. The book is available from W.W. Norton and Company, published this past January. My website, www.jeffreyboutwell.com, has more information about George, photographs from his upbringing in Massachusetts, his farm in central Massachusetts, his family life, wonderful pictures of a elegant U.S. Coast Guard cutter, the Coast Guard cutter Boutwell, that was launched in 1966. It was the largest one in the Coast Guard fleet. It served in the Persian Gulf. It served in the Gulf of Alaska, served along the west coast of South America. A beautiful, beautiful Coast Guard cutter named for George Boutwell because it was part of the Secretary's class of Coast Guard cutters named for Secretaries of the Treasury, Salmon Chase and others. And George Boutwell was honored with a Coast Guard cutter being named after him. So the website has a lot more information, various articles I've been writing for the past 4 or 5 years, ranging from, his work at the IRS and the Treasury Department to the 14th and 15th Amendments, to Reconstruction, to the Anti-Imperialist League. I'll end by saying that, people will ask, well, what do you have planned next? Do you have another book in mind? And at the moment, certainly not, because I like to describe George Boutwell as the gift that keeps on giving. Because he was in public life for so long, because he was involved in so many of the important areas of public life, like civil rights, domestic legislation, like economics and finance, like foreign affairs, I can really kind of relate anything or many things going on today to historical antecedents that George Boutwell was involved in. And I have a lot of fun doing that, and will continue to do that for the foreseeable future, as well as give talks like this one. So, Mike, thank you very much for hosting me, and it's been a pleasure being here.